Should we go ahead and start, Mary? Okay.
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Yeah, it's 12:31. I think people continue to come in, but I want to welcome everybody. I see a lot of familiar names and new names, which is great. I'm Amy Hutzel, and I'm the Executive Officer of the State Coastal Conservancy. And I'll be starting the PowerPoint and then turning it over to others. I want to introduce Mary Small, our Deputy Executive Officer, who's really leading up the strategic plan process, and then Marcus Griswold and Monica Dwight, both from Calm Waters, and they're assisting us with the engagement, and Taylor Samuelson, our Public Information Officer. And I think she's doing everything IT related on this webinar too. Yeah. Yeah, so thank you. We are kicking off the strategic plan. We've done a bit of work internally already, but we have an engagement process planned, and we really want to hear people's thoughts, opinions about the work that the Coastal Conservancy undertakes. For this webinar, what we'd love for you to do is put any questions that you have into the Q&A, and feel free to put them in at any time. And after we're done with the presentation, we will go through the Q&A questions. So next slide. So the State Coastal Conservancy, we are a state agency, one of the coastal zone agencies. We're the non-regulatory coastal zone management agency, and we act with others. Those might be the most important words in our mission statement. We work with nonprofits and tribes and other public agencies, stakeholders, community groups, to protect and restore the coast and increase public access to the coast. We work along the coast of California, in coastal watersheds, in the entire 9-county Bay Area, and in the Santa Ana River watershed. It's about a third of California geographically. Next slide. And I think Monica is doing this. We have a poll we'd like to start off with, just to see where you're coming from. What part of California do you live in or represent if you work for an entity?
Yes, so we're gonna be answering the question, what part of California do you live in or represent? And we're gonna launch the poll for where are you? Oops, sorry. Oops. Thanks for your patience. All right. So go ahead and take maybe 30 seconds or so to let us know where you are. Great. So it looks like we're coming in from lots of different places, but it looks like a big group of us are here in San Francisco Bay Area. So thank you for sharing. I'll pass it back.
Our next slide is also a poll, so we'd love to know what type of organization you represent.
Great, and that one's launching now. Go ahead and take about 30 seconds to let us know what organization you're representing today. Thanks. All right. So sharing those results. Looks like, again, we've got pretty even spread of people, but lots of people from the nonprofit sector here. So thanks for joining.
Great, yeah, thank you all. That's good information for us. And next slide. So purpose of our strategic plan, we, for the last 20 years, every 5 years have developed a 5-year strategic plan. It provides an overall vision for our agency and then has metrics to measure our effectiveness. So quantitative objectives for the Coastal Conservancy. And some things in our strategic plan have remained similar over the years, but each iteration of the strategic plan has really grown and focused what the Conservancy's vision and objectives are. Typically, our strategic plan, we don't identify specific projects. Through this strategic plan, we do want to highlight some project areas that could potentially be eligible for funding, but the strategic plan does not, for example, divide up our funding among specific projects. It's an overarching vision. Next slide. The program areas in our strategic plan are Explore the Coast. So that's our coastal access work. So completing the coastal trail, for example, but also supporting educational programs that get people to the coast and provide enjoyable experiences. Protect and restore the coast is another area, and that's really focused on protecting land and undertaking habitat restoration. And then a third program area is our Climate Ready program. And several years ago, a new chapter or sections of our enabling legislation were introduced and passed by the legislature that added climate adaptation to our project areas. In terms of our priorities within those program areas, first off, nature-based climate adaptation. So obviously there's many ways to adapt to sea level rise, for example, adapt to other climate change impacts. We are very interested in working with nature to adapt to climate change. And that's really what our enabling legislation calls for us to do. Within climate change, our two areas of focus have really been sea level rise for quite a while, and more recently, wildfire resilience. We've been receiving wildfire resilience funding over the last few years. We recognize there are many other areas of climate change impacts. The governor, with the climate resilience package, greater than $3 billion package, there are other state agencies that really focus more on other parts of climate adaptation and climate mitigation. Another priority is really benefiting under-resourced communities. And that is an area we've really tried to expand our work in over the last, I would say, 5 years with our last strategic plan. Under our last strategic plan, we had a goal of 35% of our funding supporting benefiting disadvantaged communities, which we've exceeded over the past 5 years. We also want to support projects that can serve as models. While we are receiving significant funding, knock on wood, in the FY 22-23 budget, it's not enough to do everything, and we really want to undertake projects that other jurisdictions can learn from. want to move the needle on coastal resilience. I think this it's a significant investment, and I think at the end of this particular funding, California are going to expect some, on the ground results that actually benefit communities, benefit the environment. And then we also want to support some of the long-term plans that we've been involved with, whether that's at a regional level or at a project level. It can take many, many years to move projects forward, and we've had a long investment in some project areas. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary.
Great, thanks, Amy. So I'm going to just go through quickly through a few slides to give examples of the kind of program areas and priorities that Amy talked about. Here are some pictures from some of the Explore the Coast grants that we have funded in the past, programs to bring first-time coastal visitors or kids out to the coast to really appreciate it and enjoy it. Under the Explore the Coast sort of program area, we also have a long-standing involvement in completing the Coastal Trail, the Santa Ana River Trail, the San Francisco Bay Trail, Ridge Trail, and Water Trail, and the Great Redwood Trail. Those are all within our enabling legislation as priorities of the Conservancy. Under the program area of Protect and Restore the Coast, the Conservancy has been involved in a lot of the wetland restoration projects along in the coast and around San Francisco Bay. These are pictures and maps of some of our projects in San Francisco Bay. And then under Climate Ready, as Amy just said, we have been working on projects to use nature to help adapt to climate impacts. So these are pictures of the Cardiff Beach Dune project down in San Diego, where dunes were restored as part of an effort to protect Highway 1 from the floodwater or from the ocean. And then also under our Climate Ready program, in the past year, we have been funding a lot of wildfire resilience projects. We just want to call them resistance projects, but and our focus within the wildfire world is really on vegetation management of our grasslands and our oak woodlands and our forests in a more sustainable way to reduce the wildfire risk to communities. And then, as Amy just mentioned, we also are really interested in implementing projects that have been planned for a long time. And so one example of that would be the taking down of Matilaha Dam. The Conservancy has been helping with the planning of this project for the last 20 years. We've funded, along with many other entities, some of the downstream improvements to prepare the river for the ultimate removal of the dam and allowing the sediment to flow down and restore the beach in Ventura. So these kinds of projects where we've had a long-term investment in the planning and development are projects we hope to move forward in this strategic plan. As Amy mentioned, we have had a strategic plan for 20 years, and we in each plan, we have quantified metrics and objectives, and then we track our progress. And so this is just an example of some of the metrics in our current strategic plan and where we are in year 4 in terms of implementing them. And the kinds of quantified objectives that we have include things like the % of funds that benefit disadvantaged communities, or the acres of habitat restored or enhanced, the number of projects that expand barrier-free access to the coast. So we use different kinds of metrics in our plan. And we want to build this strategic plan on the foundation of all of the work that we have been doing. And so I think many people may be aware, but in 2020, the Coastal Conservancy developed justice, equity, diversity and inclusion guidelines that were adopted by our board, which covered a lot of different aspects of our work, including partnerships, funding, meaningful community engagement, our work with California tribes. It included our staff and our board, and accountability and transparency. And so that will be part of the foundation of this strategic plan going ahead. Also, in the past year, as we have started to implement those justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion guidelines, we updated our project selection criteria, and we updated the coastal access project standards. And both of those processes took place last year with a great deal of public input. So that will be folded into the sort of foundation of this strategic plan. And of course, we also will be building on a lot of state and regional plans. There have been a lot of plans that have really laid out a vision for the kind of work that we do. And we see our strategic plan as kind of a more specific implementation plan for those plans. So many of you may have heard of the Pathways to 30 by 30 plan, the state agency Sea Level Rise Action Plan, the Wetland Recovery Projects, regional strategy. Those kinds of plans we will attempt to sort of synthesize and then build off of as we develop our strategic plan. And then, of course, there is the context, this moment that we are in. And climate change is a very daunting problem. And we know that we are at a pretty critical moment where there is a real sense of urgency of the need to take action, especially if we want to use natural infrastructure or nature-based solutions for climate adaptation. We really need to put those solutions in place now in the next 10 or 15 years in order for them to be able to have enough space to work before the sea level rises too high or the climate change has gone too far for those solutions to work. So we see this as a moment of real urgency to move forward with nature-based climate adaptation. And while that's really daunting, it is being met, that moment is being met with unprecedented funding, both for the Coastal Conservancy, for other state agencies, and through the federal government. So we received $14 million for the Explore the Coast program in last year's budget, which was a 10-fold increase for what that program has had. In the proposed or the governor's budget for this year that would start on July 1st, there's an additional 10 million for wildfire prevention and 350 million for coastal resilience, in addition to funding from Prop 68, which was a bond measure. And then anticipated in the 23-24 budget is another 150 million for the Coastal Conservancy for coastal resilience. So in total, that proposal is 500 million for coastal resilience. And this is sort of an excerpt of the budget language that accompanied that appropriation. It's for projects that build resilience for coastal communities, public access. And then there's some specific kinds of project types that are called out that you can see here. And then, as I mentioned, this is a huge amount of funding for the Coastal Conservancy. It's very exciting. And it's in the context of a really significant amount of state and federal funding. So the state of California is putting forward significant funding for the kind of work we do through appropriations to the Wildlife Conservation Board, the National Resources Agency, and Ocean Protection Council. In the Bay Area, we have Measure AA funds that voters approved that will fund the Bay Restoration Authority. And then with both the Great America Outdoors Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the federal government will be providing funding through a variety of agencies and programs, but to support both coastal resilience and public access. So it is an opportunity unlike, I've worked in this field for more than 20 years, and I have never seen this moment of so much investment coming together. So it's an exciting time to be writing a strategic plan. Amy talked about our priorities, and we wanted to kind of, they kind of come out of an overlay of several different factors. The Conservancy's guidance, like our justice, equity, diversity, inclusion guidance, our project selection criteria, our enabling legislation, the budget language, what are the resources we're being given to do, and then what are the priorities that have been identified in all of these state and regional plans. And sort of out of that, we've come up with this initial list of priority projects. And I think with that, Monica, we're going to do a poll, right? You want to go ahead?
Sure. Thanks, Mary. So we want to hear a little bit from you about your priorities for the SCC and which of those are most important to you or your organization. So go ahead and take about 30 seconds to tell us what you think. All right, and I see some answers are still trickling in, so I'll give it a few more seconds.
This is super interesting. This might be the most even split of any of them.
All right, I think I'll go ahead and end it. So yeah, as Mary said, there's a pretty even split between different priorities that we're seeing from each of you. So thank you so much for sharing that with all of us. I'll pass back to Mary.
Great, thanks. Oh, like it. Struggling. Okay, so thank you for attending this webinar. We're kind of kicking off the strategic plan update. And we, as I said, we're working to synthesize many of the state plans, like 30 by 30, to kind of pull that into our foundation. We are initiating tribal consultation. We're going to have a lot of opportunities for stakeholder input and engagement. There will be discussions there have been at all of the Conservancy's public board meetings this year. There probably will be at every board meeting a discussion of the strategic plan. And then we hope to have a draft plan out in the early summer with a public comment period over the summer, and have our board adopt the final plan in December. I do want to note that we are not going to wait to finish this. We wanted to have enough time to have a proper engagement process on the strategic plan, but we don't have to wait for the plan to be finished before we start awarding grants with the funding in the budget. So we still have a strategic plan we're operating under, and we expect to move ahead in July if the budget funding is approved. So there are a lot of things that we are seeking input on, many different elements of the plans, but things like many different elements of the strategic plan, the kinds of projects that we could prioritize. As Amy said, we don't expect the plan to identify really specific projects, but we think it would be really helpful if we had illustrative projects of these are the kinds of things we could do, that communicates to people what we're talking about better than many of our jargony words. We're looking for input on the strengths of the Coastal Conservancy and opportunities for us to improve the way that we work, input on objectives and metrics we should be using in the plan, grant process improvements, and technical assistance priorities. And I believe we're going to do a poll on, we're going to get some input on technical assistance right now. So I'll turn it over to Monica, our poll driver.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, so we'd love to hear a little bit more from you all about your technical assistance. More specifically, what type of technical assistance could you benefit from most for Conservancy program? So go ahead and take about 30 seconds to let us know what you think. see some answers still trickling in. I'll maybe give about 10 or 15 more seconds to give us your final thoughts. All right, let's see. There's also a fairly even split here.
Yeah.
You all have very diverse thoughts, so we appreciate hearing from you regarding this. All right, I will share the results. You can see, it looks like the most popular was navigating grant application and contract guidelines, but as I said, fairly even split. So thank you so much for sharing. And back to you, Mary.
Great, thanks. That is really interesting. Struggle to get back to the thing. Okay, so in terms of opportunities to engage on this strategic plan, thank you for being here. This is the first opportunity. As Amy said, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A and we will go through those at the end in like 2 slides. We're basically at the end. On our website, we have a page dedicated to the strategic plan, so you can always check there. We will be launching an online survey, I think today, to get input, and also a mapping tool where people can, it's an interactive online map, and you can enter projects and a little description of projects that you think we should think about as priorities for the Coastal Conservancy. And I know that Together Bay Area and some other entities have done similar online mapping exercises as part of looking at opportunities to implement 30 by 30. If you've already provided your data to Together Bay Area, we will just be pulling those projects over. You don't need to do it twice. You're welcome to, but you don't need to. And if there are other similar efforts you think we should just pull all of their projects in, you can email us at strategicplan, all one word, at scc.ca.gov, and we'll happily try and reduce the work for you. You can also email that address any comments or questions you have about the planning process. We are initiating tribal consultation. We expect to have future webinars, maybe focused on specific topics like wildfire resilience or other kind of program areas. As I said, we'll have a comment period on our draft plan. And then if you haven't subscribed, you should subscribe to the Coastal Conservancy's email list. That link is here. We're going to post all of these slides and we're going to send you a follow-up email after this webinar with much of this information and the links in it. So you don't need to be jotting it down. We will get that to you. And with that, I think we will go ahead and take questions. So please type your questions into the chat. I'm going to actually stop sharing because I can't see anything when I'm sharing. It's very overwhelming. And Taylor, you're going to read questions?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, I'm going to read out the questions that have come through in the Q&As, and feel free to keep sending them in as we go. So the first one, at some point, I'd like to know how the plan will ensure access for people with disabilities.
That is
Mary.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been waiting to answer that question.
Okay, go ahead.
So I'm going. No, the great question, and I've served as the ADA coordinator. Privileged to learn a lot more about access for people with disabilities. Our strategic plan, our last one, we did have. And
Amy, you keep freezing. Do you want to try turning your video
in
off?
the strategic plan. Yeah, that's too bad. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Was that happening during the presentation too?
Only at the very, very end.
Okay. So yeah, we will have quantitative objectives for supporting projects that increase accessibility for people with disabilities. I would also recommend looking at our recent adopted coastal access project standards, which are one of the documents Mary was referencing. It's on our website. I think from the strategic plan page, there's a link to it, or if you go to the about page, there's definitely a link to it. And there's a whole section on increasing access for people with disabilities. The Conservancy, we have our own transition plan, but we have limited properties that we own and manage. So we're really working with nonprofits, local jurisdictions, tribes, others to incorporate accessibility into their projects, and we're working to support them as much as possible. And then as just a little part of this, we do support beach wheelchairs, and we did a grant round a couple years ago and plan to do another grant round this year and expand it beyond beach wheelchairs to some other accessibility devices. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the next two questions that relate to tribal consultations and projects. So I'll ask one and then the next after you answer. The first one, please expand and diversify tribal consultations to include non-federally recognized tribes and Indigenous CBOs.
Absolutely. And I would, so we are doing kind of two or maybe multiple forms of tribal engagement. Formal government to government consultation with both federally and state recognized tribal governments. But we are also really interested in outreach and engagement with tribal CBOs. So if there are organizations you want to be sure that we are reaching out to, I would love it if you would email those contacts to that strategic plan, one word, at statecoastalconservancy.ca.gov. So that we aren't missing them, because we have the list of government contacts, but we don't always have a comprehensive list of the Indigenous CBOs, and we would love to engage with them.
And the next question, where does your agency stand and how will it be reflected in the strategic plan on providing funding and other forms of support to tribes in managing their ancestral coastal lands, particularly as one of the most crucial ways to fight climate change?
We are really interested in restoring both access and management rights to tribes of their ancestral lands. We have done a few projects like that along the coast, and I think I can say we're really interested in seeing opportunities to do that. So I hope that that is a part of the plan, and I think we would welcome input on what exactly the metrics should be, how we should phrase that. But it's certainly an objective that I know is reflected in our past work and is also reflected in our JEDI guidelines and would be a priority for the agency.
And I think this is a follow-up to that question. When working with tribes, how does the Coastal Conservancy plan to take in the information that tribes share and staying on top of keeping tribes involved in the process of strategic planning and other programs you're funding or supporting? And just to share, tribes are sovereign nations and should be referred to as stakeholders.
Absolutely. So that's why we're doing I'm struggling with words. We're doing formal consultation with tribal governments, both the federally recognized and the local, the state listed tribes. And we're seeking to figure out what the right form is for focus groups or other engagement with a broader set of tribal stakeholders. So we plan to do both to be sure that and to have part of the reason for having a long enough engagement timeline so that there's multiple opportunities to engage in the strategic plan.
Okay. What is the best way to participate in this effort as a community member who is not associated with a community group or government entity?
I think subscribing to our email list so that you get notified of the webinars that we're going to be doing and get copies of the draft documents so that you can review and send in your comments would probably be the best.
Are wildlife corridors highlighted in the plan? Thinking about biodiversity and sea level rise, as well as extreme heat.
Yes. Well, I mean, we haven't written the plan yet, so we're at the beginning. Our current strategic plan does have an objective related to wildlife, fish passage and wildlife corridors. So it is likely to be something that we would include in the next one.
Sorry. Will the proposed strategic plan make any mention of conservation easements as ways to address certain program priorities, such as nature-based climate adaptation, coastal resilience, to protect and restore the coast program areas?
I would expect that it would. In the past, we have had an objective related to, for example, acres conserved or protected. And I think we've had a couple of different objectives that might capture conservation easements. We've had objectives related to working lands, and often those are lands that are protected or conserved through conservation easement, or just objectives related to conservation. And we haven't really parsed in the strategic plan whether acres conserved are acres that are bottom fee title or are conserved through conservation easements. It's certainly, we have supported a lot of projects that do conservation using easements. And I think the goal might be broader of like land conserved, and then the mechanism of using an easement versus purchasing it in fee title might or might not show up in the strategic plan.
Will you engage with the Toxic Tides project and estuary restoration?
We will definitely be engaged in estuary restoration. We've been involved in tons of wetland restoration. I am not familiar with the Toxic Tides project, so it would be great to get more information about that.
Do Coastal Commission mitigation funds apply to Conservancy projects? If so, how is that funding determined?
The Coastal Conservancy occasionally receives in lieu fee mitigation from the Coastal Commission. So when a developer is having certain impacts, like Caltrans is having impacts for a road project, those funds may come to the Coastal Conservancy for the purposes of, typically they come for sort of the general purposes of mitigating whatever that impact was. And then we work with the commission to identify an appropriate project to use those mitigation funds. I would say in the grant, it wasn't on my list of funding that we have looking ahead for the next 5 years. It's not as significant a source of funding as is proposed, this proposed funding through the general fund.
Okay. I'm going to read, these are some suggestions that have been sent to us. If you can respond, I'll go through a couple. I would recommend inclusion of a goal along the lines of assist local jurisdictions in developing coastal exclusions, major vegetation removal to assist in achieving wildfire resilience for private landowners. And another goal to develop pocket parcel mitigation program to preserve microhabitats, to shift small parcels out of private ownership in order to protect microhabitats, increase small-scale wildlife corridors, and restore small impacted habitats for nature-based climate adaptation and projects that serve as models. And a metric could be acreage preserved for local jurisdiction. Yeah, and that would achieve goals for climate adaptation, retaining carbon in the land, and access goals for California tribal members as well. So those are some goals that, and for the people at the webinar too, we're obviously keeping all these questions and all this feedback, and they'll be part of what we do in our next steps in developing the plan, the draft plan.
Yeah, thanks for reading those.
Great. How do you anticipate that invasive plant management will be included in your draft plan?
In the past, invasive plant management itself has not been included as its own objective, but rather we have funded a lot of invasive plant management projects, but under broader goals like restoring baylands habitat. We've also funded some invasive plant management under our wildfire resilience program. So I would expect that we would see that as more a mechanism to achieve a goal, but the goal in the plan might be a broader concept like wildfire resilience or wetland restoration of native plants.
Do you think you'll be continuing explore the coast objectives at a similar level to currently in order to build a broad constituency of understanding and engaged supporters? Or do you think priorities might shift towards more restoration and sea level adaptation type projects?
As I mentioned really quickly, we got a significant amount of funding in last year's budget for Explore the Coast, which will carry through for this year and next year. And we are really eager to try and maintain a high level of funding for Explore the Coast. It's such a great program. And well, this might be, there's sort of Explore the Coast as the big goals, and then there's our Explore the Coast annual grant program. I guess what I would say is that both are very, very important to us, and we will be working to continue them at this higher level as long as we have the funding to do that. Maybe that's a better answer.
How is the Coastal Conservancy working to reduce regulatory impedance of conservation and public access work by nonprofits? The permitting question.
The permitting question. So we're not a regulatory agency. And I think I saw another question about sort of preventing harm from development along the coast. And that is not the role of the Coastal Conservancy. We don't have any regulatory authority. We are really interested and have been participating in the state's efforts to facilitate permitting, cutting the green tape and faster and more efficient permitting of habitat enhancement projects and public access projects. We have been providing funding for the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, which was sort of a pilot project of trying to bring the regulators together to sort out issues sooner in project development. And we've worked occasionally to help our nonprofit partners to get through permitting and CEQA. It's a little bit of a capacity issue, but it's certainly something we're interested in working on in terms of being able to advance projects more quickly, and definitely a priority, but we are not ourselves a regulator.
Yeah, and I'll ask you that question so we have it in the recording. Is any part of your strategy focused on working to protect the coast from negative impacts of good development, e.g. offshore energy, desalination, fisheries, et cetera?
Right, so that is not our role. That really is the role of the Coastal Commission. They regulate that kind of development and address the impacts.
Okay. As part of the priority setting, will strategic plan identify a funding ratio between planning and development projects and project implementation efforts? Do we have any early thinking on how the grant program will balance planning versus implementation? 1-to-1, 1-to-5?
I think, and I would actually really welcome feedback. I think, because we anecdotally hear that it's really important that the Coastal Conservancy continue to fund planning and project development. And that a lot of grant programs are less willing to fund that and want to just fund implementation. But that's a little bit anecdotal. So I think we would like to hear if that's true. Assuming that's true, I think we would continue to fund that work. It tends to take longer, see earlier conversation about cutting the green tape, but costs less than project implementation. So I'm not sure that we would I don't think we would have a formal funding ratio, but in the past, the way we have handled it is we've had objectives for plans, projects planned and projects implemented. And in fact, in some of our objectives under the current strategic plan, we're exceeding our targets for the projects we're funding the planning of, but we're kind of falling behind on the implementation targets because there were other funders that had come in, and so the projects have still been built. It's just we haven't funded the construction, we've funded the planning. So I think we would have objectives for both, and I would really welcome feedback as to whether we are right in thinking that funding planning is important.
One person thinks it is. Thanks, Robin Mitchell. It would be helpful to get debriefs from SEC staff when grant applications are rejected. Will the updated strategic plan include debriefs in the grant application process? It is disheartening to be informed an application was rejected when the only explanation given is it was a very competitive grant process. Will SEC be providing more constructive feedback?
We can certainly try to do that. I think that's a really valid request. The only potential limitation is honestly our staff capacity. Some of our grant rounds have really been overwhelmed, and we've had to say no to some really good projects. And so then I can totally imagine it's unsatisfying as an applicant to hear that that's why we said no, but that might actually be the answer. We, I think, are trying to make it a part of our process to provide a contact. So you can certainly reach out to me if there's a specific one that you want to get feedback on. And as a general comment, I think it's a good suggestion, and we will, I will say we will try, staff capacity allowing.
The Bay Area struggles with eligibility for funding that prioritizes disadvantaged communities because of how it is defined. We prefer the under-resourced communities definition, Public Resources Code 71130G, that's more inclusive. Will you consider using more inclusive definition like this one so we can serve our struggling communities?
Yes, this is both the terms I think are really difficult, and the metrics, or the way in which with the maps are drawn, or however we figure it out. For some of our past funding sources, the terminology of disadvantaged communities or severely disadvantaged communities was defined in the bonds and tied to other definitions. For the general fund money that we are getting in this budget and hopefully next year, we don't have that statutory constraint. So I think we are open to a more comprehensive definition. And I will say again that we would welcome input on what is the right terminology and the right way of defining it. But I feel like it always is somewhat problematic. But anyway, I think we're open to a more comprehensive definition, especially where we're using these general fund money, because we're not tied to the statutory definitions.
I'll just acknowledge there are a couple comments saying, please continue to fund planning projects. That's very helpful.
That is really helpful.
Yeah. Will collaborative multi-organization projects be weighted differently than single organization projects?
That's a really good question. I don't think so. Although in our new project selection criteria, a collaborative project may have an easier time of meeting some of those selection criteria. I think in the strategic plan, we're really trying to identify kind of what we want to do, and a little bit less the sort of details of how it gets done, if that makes sense. So, the number of projects and the kinds of actions that we want to take. I don't know if that's a very good answer, but
Yeah, Mary, I think
Yeah.
I would add to that. I mean, I think a collaborative multi-organization project probably would do better under many of our project selection criteria. I mean, we're looking for support of projects. And then we would also, encourage organizations to, for example, work with tribes, work with community-based organizations. Projects that are collaborative, and particularly where the collaboration is either with tribes or with community groups, I think those would do better.
Cool. How would you describe the Conservancy's ability to support long-term monitoring and research to evaluate the efficacy of nature-based solutions and demonstration projects?
inadequate. We have really struggled to fund long-term monitoring and research. I think anyone who has worked with us for a long time knows that. And really a part of that struggle is just the nature of the state budget. We are usually given money for a pretty finite amount of time. And so we can't really commit it for a long-term monitoring effort. So I know that that's a huge challenge. I know it's really, really important. But I don't know that we have figured out a solution to that.
Coastal and subtidal restoration projects, including living shorelines, often focus on oyster restoration. Can the Conservancy include in the strategic plan other shellfish restoration projects that enhance mussels and clams that are important food resources for more species and provide similar ecological services?
I think that we could. I think that might be a finer level of detail than we're going to get to in the strategic plan. I think the strategic plan might be more at the level of continue to support living shoreline projects that deliver all of those benefits, but not get to the level of which species are restored or reintroduced in a given shoreline.
Are there performance period limitations on the funding you'll receive from the state? Could these funds support proposals that support action over a longer period, like 5 years and longer?
Yes. So there are time limitations on our funding, and it's typically about 5 years. But depending on how long it takes us to award the funding.
Okay, let's acknowledge another comment saying, please continue to fund public access, regionally significant trail planning efforts. Which, yeah. Could the new strategic plan provide examples of how multiple agencies are collaborating on a project? Is a cost sharing expenditure table enough, or will SEC want to see more than that?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. For a specific grant application to us, I think a cost sharing table is usually adequate. We do, if multiple state agencies are funding a project, we do need to be sure that the accounting records are clear at the end. It's certainly something that the auditors get very freaked out about, that multiple state agencies are paying for the same thing, so it needs to be separated. Again, I don't think this is the level of, I think this is in kind of a level of detail that would apply to a specific grant and might not be covered in the strategic plan. Alternatively, and I'm not totally sure I understand the question, but alternatively, I will say that we're trying to figure out a way in the strategic plan to talk about all of the other state funding that is also available in this time period, and make it clear what the Conservancy's sort of lane is within that. And Amy talked about it a little bit, and I talked about it a little bit, but you know that there is a whole multi-billion-dollar climate package. There's money for urban heat, urban heat impacts, extreme heat impacts, that's not coming to the Coastal Conservancy. So we want to sort of help our project partners to understand we're getting this chunk of money for these kinds of things, but there's also a lot of other money for wildfire. There's a lot of other money for extreme heat that maybe isn't coming through the Conservancy, but as you think about the projects you want to do, are important resources for you. So I think that might be an answer to not that question, but
yeah, my reading of the question is also about kind of defining collaboration, and I think it is beyond cost sharing. So like in a grant application, if it is a collaborative project, and not all of the collaborators necessarily need to be funding the project. I mean, there could be in-kind services or just, collaboration. And I'm not sure that's what the question's about either. Craig, we need you to like rewrite the question for us.
I just want to reiterate to everybody on the line that, this is a kickoff webinar, and we do want to have more conversations. It's just, there are a lot of specific questions I'm sure you all have. And that's what this process is all about, is having this as an ongoing conversation. I'm sorry, it was the person who asked about mitigation funds lost their internet connection, but we've recorded the webinar and this will be posted on that scc.ca.gov/plan website. So you can do that, and we'll, all these questions are things that we will review as well, and take your comments on board. Craig says you both did a good job answering that.
Oh, Amy, you were right. All right.
So there's just the last question, Amy, when I'm sorry, she had the suggestions about goals that we could add, and was wondering if we could discuss the suggestions about assist local jurisdictions developing coastal exclusions and major vegetation removal and pocket parcel mitigation programs. Mary, Amy, if you guys want to discuss that now, or see if we can continue this conversation with Amy.
I feel like I might need a little bit more information about what coastal exclusion is. So
yeah, and I wonder, like the pocket parcel, preserving microhabitats, wildlife corridors. I mean, I think some of that might fit better with urban greening funding through the resources agency. But, we do support projects that protect and develop wildlife corridors. I mean, we've been doing that in Coyote Valley and the Liberty Canyon wildlife crossing in Southern California. So I think it kind of depends on the project and the overall goals and design of the project.
Thank you. I think that is all the questions.
perfect. Well, thank you to everybody who joined us today, and we will be sending a follow-up email, and really appreciate your taking the time. And as Taylor said, we'll be posting the recording of this as well. All right.
Thanks everyone.